hundreds of tractors blocked streets in central London, the latest protest by farmers against the government after it ended an exemption from inheritance tax for agricultural families. The measure, dubbed the tractor tax by critics, was introduced by the government in the UK to boost funds to pay for strained public services. But farmers say it will destroy family farms and also reduce food production as far as the UK is concerned. Farmers in the UK say their income has been squeezed over years by Britain's competitive supermarket sector, cheap imports from abroad, and also subsidy cuts followed by Brexit.
January 2026. Downing Street is in crisis as Prime Minister Keir Starmer confronts the most serious civil unrest of his premiership. Farmer protests that began as localized demonstrations in rural counties have exploded into a nationwide movement that's paralyzing Britain's infrastructure and threatening government stability. The numbers are staggering. Over 47,000 farmers have joined coordinated protests across 23 cities, blocking major motorways, occupying government buildings, and bringing agricultural machinery into urban centers in scenes unprecedented in modern British history. What's causing the Prime Minister to break down isn't just the scale of disruption, it's the realization that his government has lost control of rural Britain and the farmers have public sympathy that makes forceful response politically impossible. The protests that started small and exploded. January 20th, 2026. What began as a modest demonstration of 340 farmers with tractors blocking the A303 in Somerset escalated within 72 hours into the largest agricultural protest movement Britain has witnessed since the fuel protests of 2000. By January 23rd, coordinated farmer protests had spread to 23 cities including London, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and Edinburgh. Over 47,000 farmers participated, bringing an estimated 12,000 tractors and agricultural vehicles onto roads and into city centers. The protests followed a carefully coordinated strategy developed by farming organizations, including the National Farmers Union, but also more radical groups like Save British Farming that advocated direct action. Farmers blocked major motorways, including the M1, M6, M25, and M4, creating traffic chaos that affected millions of commuters. In London, approximately 8,000 farmers drove tractors through central areas, blocking Westminster Bridge, Whitehall, and roads surrounding Parliament. Agricultural vehicles parked outside the Department for Environment, Food, and Rural Affairs remained there for 3 days, despite police orders to disperse. The protesters' demands were clear and non-negotiable. Immediate suspension of environmental regulations devastating farm profitability, emergency financial support of at least £1.2 billion annually to compensate for losses, and government commitment to prioritize food security over environmental targets. "We're not asking anymore. We're demanding," said protest organizer James Crawford. "This government has destroyed farming with regulations and abandoned us with inadequate support. We're shutting down Britain until they listen." The government response that failed immediately.
We are absolutely committed to our British farmers, and that's why we've committed £5 billion to the farming budget over the next 2 years. That's the largest ever amount for sustainable food production in the UK. His party couldn't even get the money out the door for farmers, failing to spend over 300 million on farming budgets. The farmers know they ruined it for them, and that's why we're in government and they're not.
January 21st, 2026. The government's initial response to the farmer protests demonstrated a catastrophic misreading of both the protesters' resolve and public sentiment. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper authorized police to clear protesters from motorways using powers under the Public Order Act, describing the demonstrations as unacceptable disruption to critical infrastructure that cannot be tolerated. But when police attempted to enforce clearance orders on the M6 near Birmingham on January 22nd, the operation failed spectacularly. Approximately 2,400 farmers had positioned tractors and heavy agricultural equipment across all lanes. When police demanded dispersal, farmers simply locked their vehicles and sat peacefully in cabs, making removal without forcefully extracting individuals from locked machinery nearly impossible. Police commanders on scene reportedly told government officials that clearing the blockade would require physically towing over 600 tractors, a process that would take days and create images of authorities dragging farmers from vehicles. optics that would be politically catastrophic. The failed enforcement attempt emboldened protesters nationwide. Within hours of the Birmingham standoff, farmers intensified blockades on other motorways, adding more vehicles and participants. "They can't arrest all of us, and they can't tow 12,000 tractors," one farmer told reporters at a Manchester blockade. "We're staying until the Prime Minister comes out of his office and addresses our demands in person, not through press releases written by advisors who've never set foot on a farm." The Prime Minister's breakdown during crisis meeting.
Your figures very much differ from what the figures that the farmers are holding up in their banners today. Do you think those farmers have been gulled, maybe, by some tax-dodging millionaires who want them out there demonstrating like this?
Well, look, I support our farmers. I think it's very important we do so, and that's why we put a huge amount into. We put £5 billion into farming over the next 2 years, and food sustainability. It's hugely important.
What's going
for farmers
on the streets? Why are they there?
Well, I think the most important thing that I can do is to engage in dialogue and be absolutely clear. For a typical case, parents wanting to pass on to their child a farm, so that's a typical case. The threshold is £3 million, and that means the vast majority, before anyone pays inheritance tax, that means the vast majority of farms will be totally unaffected by this. And it's important, I think, that I do keep restating that, because that's a very high threshold.
Our viewers will have heard that.
January 24th, 2026. During an emergency cabinet meeting convened to address the escalating farmer protests, Prime Minister Keir Starmer reportedly suffered what multiple sources present described as an emotional breakdown that shocked ministers and revealed the extreme pressure he's experiencing. According to detailed accounts from 3 separate sources, the meeting had been tense from the start as ministers argued about response strategies, with Home Secretary Cooper advocating for more aggressive police action, while Environment Secretary Emma Reynolds warned that such tactics would backfire politically. When Chancellor Rachel Reeves stated that the Treasury could not provide the £1.2 billion in emergency agricultural support that farmers demanded, citing fiscal constraints and competing priorities, Starmer reportedly stood up abruptly and shouted, "Then what exactly am I supposed to tell them? That we destroyed their livelihoods with regulations but can't afford to help? That we care more about budget numbers than whether Britain can feed itself?" Sources present describe Starmer as visibly shaking, his voice breaking as he continued, "I'm watching this government fall apart. Rural Britain hates us. Farmers are blocking motorways. My own MPs are in revolt. And you're all sitting here arguing about whose department's responsibility it is, while the country descends into chaos." One minister present said the Prime Minister appeared on the verge of tears, his frustration and exhaustion overwhelming his normally composed demeanor. After a moment of stunned silence, Starmer reportedly told ministers, "I'm going out there. I'm meeting with the protest leaders face to face because clearly nothing else is working." When advisors cautioned against such direct engagement without a concrete offer to present, Starmer allegedly responded, "I don't care anymore. This can't continue." The Prime Minister left the meeting abruptly, leaving cabinet members uncertain about next steps and deeply concerned about his state of mind. The farmers with public sympathy.
Well, let's speak now to Jack Carson about farmers, shall we? Because they've staged a surprise blockade of 3 major supermarket distribution centres near Peterborough for the last 2 hours. They're demanding higher farmgate prices and they're accusing retailers of squeezing producers while prices rise for consumers. While loaded lorries are currently prevented from entering or leaving the sites, while empty vehicles and supermarket staff arriving for work are allowed through.
Now, our national reporter Jack Carson, we go to him and he will tell you more.
This is gone.
Thank you very much. Well, we've been here since 4 a.m. This morning when these farmers arrived. You've been exclusively allowed to be at this protest. You can probably see some of the tractors behind us here, which are completely blocking this distribution centre, supermarket distribution centre in Peterborough. What you can't see off camera is the lorries that are now starting to queue up, unable to get in.
What makes the farmer protests particularly dangerous for the government is the substantial public sympathy protesters have garnered, despite the significant disruption they're causing. Polling conducted by YouGov on January 23rd showed that 58% of Britons supported the farmers' right to protest, with 52% agreeing that the government has treated farmers unfairly with environmental regulations. Only 31% of respondents wanted police to forcefully clear the protests. The public sympathy stems partly from the protesters' discipline and messaging. Farmers have maintained strictly peaceful protests, with no reports of violence or property damage. They've allowed emergency vehicles through blockades and have engaged politely with frustrated commuters, handing out leaflets explaining their situation. Many protesters are elderly farmers or families with children, creating sympathetic images that dominate media coverage. I've been stuck in traffic for 3 hours because of this protest, and honestly, I support them, one London commuter told reporters. These are people who feed us, and the government has destroyed their ability to make a living. If blocking roads is what it takes to get attention, then good for them. This sentiment, repeated across social media and interviews, demonstrates how effectively farmers have communicated their plight and positioned themselves as victims of government policy failure rather than troublemakers. The opposition seizing political opportunity.
Taking our party from a party of protest to a party of government, they're hurtling in the opposite direction.
What a load of nonsense, Mr. Speaker. Yes. We had a budget in March this year and tractors were not blockading the streets of Whitehall afterwards. So let me give him another example of a real business, Following his budget, the head of McVitie's has said that it has been harder to understand what the case for investment in the UK is. So while the Prime Minister has been hobnobbing in Brazil, businesses have been struggling to digest his budget. Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that the Employment Rights Bill shows that it is not only the ginger nut that is causing him problems?
I was attending the G20. I suspect on their current trajectory, they don't know whether they're going to attend the G20 or not. Maybe the Policy Commission will come up with an answer on that one.
The farmer protests have provided opposition parties with devastating political ammunition against the Labour government. Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch has positioned her party firmly on the side of farmers, attending protests in her constituency and giving speeches condemning government agricultural policy. This Labour government implemented economically destructive regulations without understanding rural realities, then abandoned farmers when the predictable disaster occurred. She said, at a January 22nd protest in Lincolnshire, "These farmers blocking roads aren't criminals. They're desperate people fighting for survival against a government that doesn't care about them." Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey has similarly embraced the protests while criticizing both Labour's regulations and Conservative Brexit policies that he argues contributed to the agricultural crisis. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage has been even more vocal, calling the protests the rural uprising against metropolitan elites who've never done a day's manual labor telling farmers how to farm. The opposition support has energized protesters and created political cover for the demonstrations. When Labour MPs criticized the disruption, opposition parties immediately defend farmers' right to protest, making government attempts to characterize the movement as unreasonable appear out of touch and unsympathetic. The impossible situation with no good options. The Prime Minister's breakdown during the cabinet meeting reflects the impossible situation the government faces. Providing the £1.2 billion emergency support farmers demand means abandoning fiscal discipline and setting precedent for subsidizing other struggling sectors. Suspending environmental regulations means abandoning climate commitments and appearing to cave to pressure. Forcefully clearing protests risks violent confrontation with sympathetic protesters and political backlash. Starmer's reported decision to meet directly with protest leaders represents either a desperate attempt to personally negotiate resolution or an acknowledgement that he's lost control of the situation. Either interpretation suggests a prime minister and government in crisis, unable to manage the consequences of their own policies and facing unprecedented rural unrest. The farmer protests spread nationwide and the prime minister broke down because the crisis exposed the fundamental unsustainability of current agricultural policy and the government's inability to respond effectively when farmers decided they had nothing left to lose. Britain's rural areas are in revolt, its infrastructure is paralyzed, and its government appears powerless to resolve a crisis of its own making.